Okay, everybody. So I hope everyone enjoyed reading chapters 2 and 3 of Intimacy or Integrity this week. I think it's a great place to start a course like this where we're talking about cultures and worldviews and just methods that are very different than maybe what we're used to. So I was looking at everybody's responses from the pre-assignment about what it means for something to be true and how we get there. What methods can we use to reach knowledge of the truth? And the answers were pretty much what I expected to see. Things like something's true if you know that it can be proven. Something's true if it's a fact and not an opinion, someone said. A few people mentioned science being a key component of what makes something true. And that's pretty standard. That's pretty much how I think about truth as well. So as you read in the chapters, that's very consistent with what Kasulis calls the integrity worldview or epistemology. Epistemology just being a philosophical way to say the study of truth and knowledge and the means of arriving at truth and knowledge. So instead of talking about integrity, which I think everybody would agree after the reading and after the discussion that that's more or less the worldview that we have here in America or here in Canada, where I'm recording this right now. I want to talk about the intimacy epistemology with you all tonight, because that's the one that's going to be different, and that's the one that I think is going to be new. And maybe even more importantly, that's the one that we're going to see a lot of throughout the course of this semester. So I'm going to screen share with everybody here tonight and talk about the characteristics of the intimacy worldview from the reading this week. So if you did the reading, it should be pretty familiar, and maybe you could ask some questions as we go. And if you didn't do the reading, well, it'll all be familiar to you in another 10 minutes or so. So in contrast to many of the integrity characteristics that people correctly identified in the pre-assignment, the intimacy worldview has some differences. First of all, the intimacy worldview is objective, but not in the same way, if that makes any sense. And you might question how you can have multiple types of objectivity. We're going to talk about that here tonight. Something that people didn't really talk about in the assignment was the way that relationships work. And we don't really think about truth and knowledge as relationships, I don't think. But the intimacy worldview does in a very fascinating way that we'll see. If you've ever heard the expression that the facts don't care about your feelings, that's the exact opposite of how the intimacy worldview looks at that. We saw in chapter 2 that the intimate knowledge is very emotionally related. The feelings that you get from acquiring certain knowledge are a key component of that knowledge to you. You can't just neatly separate them, which ties right back into that second bullet point about the way relationships work. Very, very closely related to that, we saw in the chapter that intimacy has a somatic component. It's physical. It isn't just conceptual or intellectual. It's not only in your mind. It's going on in your body as well. If you've ever heard the term a gut feeling, I think that's a very good example of this. And then finally, this last one, when we think about knowledge and integrity, it's very much open to other people to see. It's something that anybody can look at and reflect on. Whereas here, it's often dark, is the expression that's used. So we'll see some examples of this. So first of all, there's a distinction made between personal objectivity that's talked about in the chapter. And what it basically is that experts, when viewing a set of data, are looking for different things than when non-experts are looking at that same information. And the criteria that they are evaluating are different based on years of training and experience, for example. Information that's publicly available is not necessarily the most reliable. It's not necessarily the best, because not everyone is an expert. And we see some experts here, Dr. McGonigal is an expert in transfiguration. Now, I don't know anything about transfiguration, so I would not be the person to ask. And if I Google it, that might not give me the best knowledge. So the solution is to seek out an expert when seeking objective advice or information. I think a wonderful example of this is actually kind of relevant. I know during the pandemic, every time I had a chill or a slight muscle ache, I was going on Google and typing in symptoms of COVID because I was worried that I was sick. And luckily, I never was any of the times I Googled it. There were other times, but that's another story. Anybody can access information on the internet. But having a trained professional like your doctor evaluate your same symptoms is going to give you a much more reliable conclusion because they are an expert. They have a type of objectivity that takes years of training to acquire. And that's a really important part of this intimacy perspective. The example that we'll see when we start talking about Buddhism and Hinduism in a few weeks here is that the guru is the authority on the text. Anybody can read the scriptures, but only the guru can interpret it correctly because he knows what he's doing. He's spent his whole life devoted to it and training. And there's a big difference here between subjectivity and objectivity that's made that I think is really important. Maybe the most important nuance of this whole chapter. When we talk about something being subjective, it's opinion-based. I like the color green. That's entirely subjective. But the personal objectivity of this chapter is factual information. It's something that a trained eye can see that might seem subjective, that might seem random, but is not. Skip ahead, we have these judges, they're a good example. But I think another good example is this image here. To the untrained eye, this is just a random bird. We don't really know what's going on. To someone that's done a little bit of bird watching, you might say, oh, it's a woodpecker, it's digging a nest. And to someone that's familiar with this species, you would know that it's a red-breasted nuthatch. And what she's actually doing is taking pine resin and coating the outside of her nest because it keeps away bugs and it keeps away squirrels, which are two creatures or types of creatures that would threaten her young. And that's just one example of how, based on your level of knowledge, what you see in one image can change. And that's very important. And it's really important if you're graduating in a few weeks or a few months, when you hit that job market and you're asked about experience. Employers cherish experience because it teaches us things that no amount of Google research can. So experience is a key part of this orientation. As are relationships. Very simply put, the intimate relationship is about the two members of that relationship coming together and forming a new third reality. And when that relationship is broken, something is missing from both of those parties. It is not like the very intellectual, very cerebral relationship of integrity, where if I lose something, my relationships belong to me. If I lose one, I just go on Tinder and find another one. It's not quite that simple here. It's much more holistic, if you want to use that term. And basically everything's connected. And as we study Buddhism especially, we'll see that this is really, really important. And actually, the self of Buddhism is composed entirely of its relationships with others, to the extent that if you take away all the relationships, there's nothing left. And that's a very controversial topic that we'll get to in a few weeks. Just to kind of move through these last few pretty quickly, because they're all kind of really similar, there's an affective or emotional component to knowledge in the intimacy worldview. Depending on my mood, depending on my attitude and my perception of a reality, that will actually shape how I interpret and understand it. Okay, so I could read this text when I'm in a good mood and it could bring me peace and serenity. Or I could read this text when I'm having a bad day or a bad month or a bad decade, and it'll just make me cynical and angry. My emotional response to something is taken seriously. It isn't something to be dismissed or dispensed with, as we often see in integrity kind of science, STEM disciplines, I guess. So that's a very interesting one. As is the concept of knowledge in intimacy being somatic as well as psychological. Now, what this basically means is that your physical cues and your physical reactions to things are actually part of your knowledge and your understanding of them. So the best two examples I can think of is that no matter what the situation is, a mother can tell what's wrong with her child. The kid comes home from school, they don't want to talk, they're being withdrawn. The mother asks what's wrong, and the kid says, "Nothing, I'm fine." The mother has a gut intuition that something is off, and she will usually pester the child until they reveal what's wrong. Similarly, if you're in a close love relationship with someone, just watching their body language, the way they fidget, you can tell that someone's nervous. You tell I'm fidgeting right now as I'm recording this. I'm a little nervous. You can see the way that somebody slumps down and tell you that they're defeated. That's a key part of their perception and their understanding. And long story short, when you have a gut intuition, you should listen to it. You should not ignore the biofeedback that you get from the situations that you're placed in. And lastly, the knowledge of intimacy is dark. And what that means is that it's not a step-by-step formulaic kind of process. Sometimes you just know something. And in this worldview, that's acceptable. I think about math tests I took in high school when I had to show my work, how I got from the problem on the board to the answer on my exam. If I missed any of those steps, I lost points or I didn't get credit at all. That's a very integrity kind of way of looking at, of problem solving, where all the steps are plainly visible to everyone. Whereas intimate knowledge accepts that sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes you just know. And as bizarre as that sounds, that can hold an authority all its own. To stick with the analogy of an exam, it's kind of like when you're taking a multiple choice test and you instinctively answer with B, but you start to second guess yourself and you put A as your answer instead. You get the test back and it turns out that B was the correct answer. There's something to listening to those initial movements that you have. And part of this theory is the acceptance that those intuitions can be right most of the time. So that's a super condensed, quick version of chapter 2. You'll find the characteristics of integrity in chapter 3. And I'm looking forward to see what everyone's reaction to these two theories are. And that's the post discussion for the week. Which of these do you think is better and why? Or which of these speaks to you or doesn't? Maybe you think they're both bad. That's perfectly all right. Just make an interesting discussion post out of it. So next week, we'll talk a little bit more about method. We'll talk a little bit about comparative theology and what kind of things we'll actually be looking for in studying these other religions and what they can offer to a Christian society, to a Western context. So make sure you read chapter 1 of Largan, and I'll see you all next week. Thanks, everybody.